Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to our online seminar entitled The Longevity Code. When I realized for the first time that coronavirus does present a certain danger, I was in the United States on a roadshow where I held the 2-day certification courses in 5 different places. And I realized for the first time that Covid19 or coronavirus does present a certain danger. Not so much the virus itself, but the implications on our lives. I then took 3 decisions for myself. The first decision being that I want to step up the game. What do I mean by that? I'm now going to look at my energy, at my health program, at my workout program, because it is quite likely that the corona situation will cost us a substantial part of our lives. Maybe it's just a few months during lockdown, or perhaps we will have to wait or go back to start like with the board game Monopoly, with certain projects that we already started. But we can turn back time simply by pushing back our biological age or bio age, which is great because it will give us more lifetime. We can enjoy our children, our grandchildren or great-grandchildren for longer by pushing back our biological age. And if we succeed in doing that, we can be fairly relaxed. We may lose a couple of months, perhaps 1 year or 2 years, but that's what I mean by stepping up the game. Secondly, in addition to following social distancing regulations, I will embark on what I call negative distancing. I will stay away from anything that could create fear, trigger fear, because it's usually not the good people working with fear. That's a master rule. And I want to take an input break. I will make sure that I will reduce the time I spend communicating digitally with the outside world as much as possible. Why? We'll come back to this at a later stage. And the third decision I took was that I said, I'm just going to accept from 1 minute to the next that the crisis is the new normal. Because leaving physiology aside, stress represents tension between the current status and the desired status. What we expect from our lives, what we have built up on the one hand, and the current situation on the other hand. This creates tension, it creates stress. And as soon as we come to terms with such a situation, that is to say, we accept the current status as not overlapping with the desired status, and we just accept this as the new normal, stress will be gone immediately. And I think this is a very important decision, a deliberate decision we have to take to say, well, the crisis is the new normal. We don't look to the right, we don't look to the left, we just go for it. Which basically means I'm just going to stick to my new concept. What I'm going to show you now are measurement values. And these values show what I measured with the vital monitor. That's an interesting situation here because 6 weeks down the line I can already see the first successes. For the first time in 4 years I worked intensively on pushing my biological age down to 25 years. In the past, the maximum I succeeded in achieving was 25.5 years. After 6 weeks, we can see the values for regeneration and stress. At the end of the week, at the end of the 9th of April, after an intensive week, I was clearly above 100% regeneration. This is the status I woke up in, and stress was down to 0. So a very good result indeed. So let's get started with our online seminar. I call it the Longevity Code because many things have to do with biological age. And I very deliberately call it a code, because there's also a thing called biohacks or hacks. And I don't like the term, because a hack we usually associate with something negative. We hack a computer, we hack a system, which is why I prefer the term code. And this is what it's all about. It's about improving our longevity with a number of measures that we deliberately take. And let me go back to Covid-19 for a second. We know that the younger we are, the lower the risk of actually developing symptoms in case of infection. And the second important point to bear in mind is that the older we get, the higher the risk of chronic diseases. If we succeed in pushing back our biological age, we also bring down the risk of chronic diseases. And we are less exposed in case of infection, in case of COVID-19. So let's get started with the vital monitor. We need some way to measure how we are doing, how the things we change in our lives have an impact. Only if we can measure something do we find motivation to improve our way of life. So what we measure here is heart rate variability, HRV. These are the values for last Sunday, and you can see that on the vertical axis the amplitude is sometimes more pronounced, sometimes less. The signal may be higher or lower, and you can also see that horizontally the intervals show different lengths. This is heart rate variability. As a non-expert, I am inclined to think that it would make sense to have a very regular heart rate, but that's not true. This is the emergency mode, which means in such a situation we're no longer in a position to appropriately respond to external stimuli. The situation is as it is here. If we have changing amplitudes and changing intervals, this illustrates that we are in a position to respond to what's happening around us. Ancient doctors like Paracelsus or Hippocrates put it nicely. They said, as soon as your heart rate is as regular as a woodpecker working on a tree or raindrops knocking on your roof, death is imminent. At the time, they didn't have the analyses, methods, or measurements that we have. They just looked at the patients, observed patients very carefully. Actually, in German, the word for treatment literally translates as handling. That is to say, physically applying your hands to the patients. Today, the situation is different. You have a desk, there's the doctor on one side, the patient on the other hand, nobody applying any hands to anyone. And now we have the second phase. We are told how to breathe, and this vital monitor, the HRV monitor, measures the degree to which our heart rate influences or responds to the way we breathe. Our breathing rhythm, if we are in a strong position and regenerate easily, can have an influence on our heart rate. Breathing influencing the heart rate and the autonomous nervous system. What we're measuring here basically is stress and regeneration. Stress represents the sympathetic nervous system. This is the part of the nervous system we can usually not influence or control, even though there are some methods to do that. There's the Wim Hof breathing method, which we will look at in part 2. This method helps to influence the autonomous nervous system as well. We can then go online very quickly for a few seconds, and the measurements are calculated here. This is the result last Sunday: 101% in terms of regeneration, stress 12%, biological age 25.5%, and a recommendation as to what degree we can work out, what kind of exercise to perform. We can save this information and get this. This is the week from the 30th of March to the 5th of April, and the development over the entire week. All right. Just imagine the following. We have a system which was conceived to handle short-term stress. Acute short-term stress, as we are going to see later, is something which is very healthy because it triggers our survival mechanism. We call this the flight, hide, fight method. You basically run away, or you hide, or you remain still. This is the sympathetic nervous system, and we have adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol being triggered. They trigger physiological reactions. The internal organs pretty much come to a stop, particularly the digestive system. Blood vessels become constricted, blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up, in order to make sure that our muscles are ready for the flight or fight mode. Our pupils dilate. If you see someone with strongly dilated pupils, this person is probably exposed to a lot of stress. And something else happens. Saliva production increases. Just think back of your maths class when you had to walk up to the blackboard. Suddenly your mouth became dry because you were under stress. You felt the sweating, which was the result of the body trying to regulate its temperature and to make sure we become slippery, to be able to escape in a fight. The most important thing for us as medical people is to fully understand why chronic stress makes us ill. What happens basically is that our immune system is stopped. Wound healing is stopped completely because it requires a high level of energy. Just think back of when you were in bed last time with a temperature. You didn't want to move a little finger because you felt extremely weak, and it would take an enormous amount of energy to move. And it doesn't make sense in a survival situation to invest into regeneration. And as soon as we're out of this dangerous situation, once we have run away from the saber-toothed tiger or from a war situation, if we're up on a tree, across the river, in the cave, on a rock, the parasympathetic nervous system starts working. Acetylcholine is emitted, our pupils become narrower, and the digestive system starts working properly again. And now it's time for wound healing. We may have been injured during the fight, and these injuries have to be healed now. And our immune system is working again. This was the plan nature had. Nature never had the plan that we should be exposed to a high level of stress over days, weeks, months, 24/7. But we live in the world we live in, which means that the healing mechanism, this mechanism of the immune system, cannot really set in. During our final examinations as medical students, something similar happened. We didn't feed properly, we didn't sleep properly, but still were pretty much successful in our exam. Nobody was ill. And once we completed our final exams, we took a breath, we relaxed, we celebrated. And what happened? Many of us went down with a flu. They became ill because after months of adrenaline, noradrenaline and cortisol, we reached a state of relaxation again. We emitted acetylcholine, and the immune system suddenly said, oh, so many bacteria, we've got to get rid of them all. I'm sure you remember that as well. When you go on holidays, you're usually ill the first few days because you were exposed to ongoing stress before the holidays. And your immune system wasn't strong enough. That's a very important hint. If you never had a temperature over many, many years, it's not a good sign. It makes perfect sense to be ill once a year, have a high temperature. We know with Covid-19, the most stupid thing to do is to take antipyretic drugs to bring down the fever. Because with every degree of fever, the strength of our immune system doubles from 37 to 38, 39, 40, 41. And viruses cannot survive high temperatures. The same is true for Covid-19. And if we take antipyretic drugs, it's totally counterproductive. So it would make perfect sense to be ill once a year. Our immune system rebels, works properly, we sweat intensively overnight, and then get up the next day and feel fit again. This would be a good situation. If we are at 38.5 degrees over many, many weeks, it's not good. If you're never ill over many, many years, take a closer look at your immune system. And that's what we're going to do now. Here we have a very nice example to the left with two patients. We've got a patient to the left, regeneration at 40%, stress level at a moderate level, 71 biological age, even though this patient is only 40 years old. 13 milliseconds in terms of heart rate. So this patient would have very regular heart rate, and to the right hand side you can see a regeneration level of 114%, stress at 9%, biological age 26.3. Again, a 40-year-old patient. The patient to the left, if this patient is exposed to this situation over various days or weeks at 40% of regeneration, I would be worried about this patient, because at one point or another this patient will run into a wall and reach a weak point and will develop a chronic disease. Now to the right hand side, this patient, there's no need to worry about him, because here you can clearly see that this patient is always in a positive situation between 70 and 114, a low level of stress, which basically means that this patient is unlikely to develop a chronic disease. Now, what's interesting here with these two patients is that it's not actually two patients, it's one and the same person. To the left, we have the measurement before a dental intervention, a dental treatment. We have some cause of disruptions or cause of stress from the oral cavity, and to the right we can see the measurement after the treatment. We always do that. We measure on the day before the treatment and in the week after the treatment, and we can show our patients that they are much better in regenerating after the treatment and that they were able to push back their biological age. We also started a scientific study and are getting in the first results. We actually published in Dallas for the first time a few weeks ago. We looked at other hard facts such as mitochondrial functions or telomere length, and we were able to prove that as a result of this treatment method, telomere length was extended and mitochondrial function was improved. These are very impressive results and very much support what I just presented to you. But of course they are only worthwhile if we can show that lower biological age also enables better regeneration. Let's now take a look at what the data could look like. These are the last 6 weeks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in fact. 8 weeks basically before COVID broke out. To the very left we have the week before I traveled to the United States. And in the subsequent 5 weeks, I was exposed to a lot of stress. I lived in the hotel all the time. All the hotels were climatized. No way of opening a hotel window. So I arrived on the 17th. I was in a very good situation. The line goes down a little bit, but I was able to keep the level fairly high. And on the 17th of March, I came back to Switzerland. And you can see in the penultimate week, we can see that I reached a low point there, and this was in fact when I felt some sort of infection. And actually some colleagues mentioned this, and they said, well, Ulrich, last week on Thursday and Friday when you were on television, it was obvious that you didn't feel well. I started with a vitamin C infusion 5 days in a row. I also made sure I slept a lot and was able to regenerate quickly despite the workload I was exposed to. And you can see that in the very last week I was in a very, very good situation again. So despite stress, Of course, everyone is exposed to stress at one point or another. I'm under a lot of responsibility as well. I've assumed additional tasks as well because a large part of my team is in short time working mode. So despite such a stressful situation, it is possible to regenerate. And I was successful in doing that, as you were able to see on the first slide. And I was able to push back my biological age to 25.4 this morning. Take a look at the 27th here, when I wasn't feeling particularly well, where the line was red. The system tells me I slept for a bit more than 7 hours, 7 hours 21 minutes, time spent in bed, but I actually only slept 6 hours and 34 minutes. So there must have been 1 hour in between when I was awake. I took some time to fall asleep and I was awake again at 2 o'clock. Why 2 o'clock? Well, that's the liver time, the detox time, and I was also awake before waking up in the morning. You can also see heart rate at rest here. This is the number of beats per minute, 53 beats per minute, which is pretty much okay, but could be better. Usually I have heart rate at rest of about 50. Still, I was successful to spend 1 hour and 40 minutes in a deep sleep phase, which is good for my age. And I was also able to extend the REM phase to 28%. So the measures that I took here, we'll talk about them later, did have a positive influence on my sleep pattern during this phase of infection, during this phase where I didn't feel well, and get out of this difficult patch very quickly. The day after, I was already in a very positive phase, so recovery didn't take long. Here we have two points on the same axis, which basically means that we performed two measurements at the same time. This is when I performed the Wim Hof breathing method. And you can see already that with this method, I was able to reduce stress in a short period of time. This is basically to explain the L shape of the curve here. Here you go. Here's the spotlight on the curve. And on top, you can see that I was able to improve our regeneration value. The second tool I use is the Aura Ring, which has a measurement device and a chip to store the data. This Aura Ring is very useful. I actually met the developer and owner of the Aura Ring and talked to him and suggested a few modifications, and he has now also added a flight mode to this ring. So in the evening I can turn the ring on flight mode, no radiation whatsoever. I put it back in the charging station in the morning and then look at the values. During the day I turn it off, and in the evening I look at the values again in order to make sure I've covered the number of kilometers I wanted to cover. So it's very important to take action quickly, to be able to measure quickly without a huge effort. I use the HRV tool. It's fairly cheap, less than 400 euros, and the Aura Ring is less than 300 euros. I've been using it for 1 year. The HRV Monitor I've been using for more than 5 years. There are more tests on biological age. One test would be to sit down on the floor with your legs crossed and try and stand up without using your hands. I'm going to show you what the exercise looks like. It's always good to have a soft surface, a carpet or a rug, or perhaps a gymnastics mat. You sit down with your legs crossed like this, and then try and move your weight so as to stand up from this position. You just saw the exercise, trying to get up without using your hands. This is an excellent way of measuring your agility. I read this for the first time in a book published by Sinclair, a professor at Harvard. I'll come back to this publication later on, and immediately applied this in my hotel room in New York. I did not succeed in getting up at all. But during those days, I was exposed to electromagnetic fields a lot. I had to be online a lot because we had to organize many things from remote locations. And I actually read studies on this issue. If we are exposed to EMF fields regularly, we become stiffer. Our muscles, our ligaments are not as flexible as they should be. We feel older. So take a look at this, and I felt this myself. It was very impressive. On days where I use my smartphone a lot, I find it much more difficult to get up. On days where I'm hardly using my mobile phone, I find it easy to get up without using my hands. If we succeed easily in getting up without using our hands, our biological age is probably below 30. Secondly, the idea would be to find out how many push-ups you can do. And I mean real, proper push-ups. So basically you go down until your nose or your chest touches the floor, and then when going up you properly stretch through your arms. So real, proper push-ups. As for your biological age, you tend to be able to perform fewer push-ups the older you get. So you try to go to the maximum, take the number, subtract it from 70, and that's your biological age. So let's assume that I'm 70 years of age and I want to have a biological age of 30. I would have to be able to complete 40 push-ups. That's how you can calculate it. Or if you succeed in performing 40 push-ups, it's just your normal age minus 40, irrespective of your age, of course. And the third tool I would suggest is a hand dynamometer. It's a tool to measure the power you have when pushing someone's hand. So if you really want to crush someone's hand, you press as hard as you can, and this tool measures the force you are able to exert. You put in your age and it will tell you whether you are on a high level, on a moderate level, or on a low level as for your biological age. Here's the tool. This is the hand dynamometer. You enter your age. Then you grab the tool like this with your preferred hand and then try and squeeze it as best you can. And then the tool will show you the weight you've been able to exert, 54.4 kilograms, and it will tell you whether you are on a top level, on a normal level, or on a low level. This tool gives us a great way of measuring our biological age in addition to the HRV Monitor. I'd like to show you some slides to do with Covid-19 to show you the risk pattern with regard to your age. And you can see that at the age of 80 you are much more likely to die of Covid-19 compared to 20 to 29 years of age, for example. 0 to 9 years, almost no risk. 10 to 19, a bit more. It doesn't mean that you have to be afraid if you're 80 years of age, because this is something that affects society at large, and it depends on your biological age. If you are 80 years of age and have a biological age of 30 or 40 years and have no chronic illnesses, you are just as safe as everyone else. But somebody at the age of 35 and a biological age of 60, 65, and chronic diseases, perhaps some cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, such a person would have a much higher risk of dying from COVID. So it doesn't really matter what our passport says. What's important is our biological age. This is what's really important. Now, this is the book I mentioned earlier, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. David Sinclair, professor at Harvard, wrote this book. I'll come back to his antagonist, Professor Birkmeyer from Vienna. We just had him in an interview at the Swiss BioHealth News Show, you might remember. We can see here that aging is the most important single risk factor for many chronic diseases. Chronic diseases such as cancer, the metabolic syndrome, neurodegenerative diseases. And if we're able to tackle aging itself, rather than just focusing on some individual chronic diseases, the strategy is much more promising. There's no point in looking at one chronic disease after the other. We will always lag behind the development a little bit. But if we tackle the only real disease, according to Sinclair, aging in other words, and if we look at aging as a disease, and if we tackle aging and work on aging, we automatically treat all the other chronic diseases as well, and also bring down the risk of severe consequences of a COVID-19 infection. Take a look at these slides here. No matter what chronic disease we choose, we can always see that the risk is clearly higher the older we become. Here we have myocardial infarction, heart attack in other words, then we have heart diseases, and number 3 is the metabolic syndrome or diabetes. This curve, this graph, only starts at the age of 60. That's the likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease. It's almost 0 at the age of 60, but then picks up very, very quickly. For a person at 90 years of age, it makes perfect sense to try and push back your biological age to 60 in order to bring down the Alzheimer's disease risk to 0. You can take any disease, take cancer for example. It starts picking up at 40-45 years of age, the biggest risk being at 70, and it actually goes down further on because the mitotic rate is less. You can also look at it from a different perspective. One thing is clear, smoking is a risk factor for cancer, and it increases the risk factor by 5. If you are 50 years of age, your risk of developing cancer is 100 times higher. If you are 70 years of age, your risk of developing cancer is 1,000 times higher. And it's definitely a bad idea to be a chain smoker, because your risk multiplies only by a factor of 5. But aging is actually the biggest risk factor for any chronic diseases, much more so than the chronic diseases themselves, because at the end of the day, it's all down to aging. Take a look at aging, at the mechanism of aging. We can see here that we have a scales here. To the left hand side you can see the youth, and you can see the physiological processes that are going on. DNA is becoming repaired, mitochondrial activity is more pronounced, we become more stress resistant, we preserve and build stem cells, autophagia, autodigestion of old cells is fueled. We also reduce inflammation, particularly chronic inflammation. We'll come back to this point at a later stage. And the telomere length is preserved. Telomeres are basically the tails, little tails at the end of DNA. Every time we have mitosis, the telomeres become shorter and shorter and shorter until they're completely used up, until they're so short that they send a signal to the cell that they cannot split anymore. That's what we call a senescent cell, an old used cell, and the body then has to remove these cells in an ideal case. This is why senolytics are being developed, senolytics to eliminate these senescent cells, because they lead to premature aging, to chronic inflammation also, but also to degeneration. If we go slightly further up, we can see that we have the FOXO mechanism, and this FOXO mechanism can be triggered in various ways. These mechanisms are as follows. We have the big bar on top, which handles all these mechanisms. TOR, for example, target of rapamycin, for example, or AMPK, sirtuins, in other words. Sirtuins are longevity genes, sirtuin 1 to sirtuin 7. They are all controlled by the bar on top, and you can see calorie restriction there. As soon as we stop eating, it's okay to have 16 to 8 fasting cycle of 16 to 8. I'll come back to this at a later stage, but also through exercise, any kind of workout is positive, particularly the short-term acute stress also, which is triggered. These mechanisms become activated. And here we come back to mechanisms that reduce your biological age or extend your life. We also have another interesting substance, NAD+, which we're going to take a closer look at. Take a look at this mechanism. To the right-hand side, we have the chart by David Sinclair. And to the left-hand side, we have Professor Birkmeyer from Vienna. He has a slightly different approach. And what we can do now is combine the two to see what is possible. Here we have NADH, which is produced in the citrate cycle in our food, combined with oxygen. And we can see how important breathing is. Without proper breathing, we cannot add enough oxygen into the chain. And we will talk about this when we talk about the Wim Hof breathing method. We build ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is basically the energy supplier per se. It's like a battery, it's like an energy cell, a fuel cell. We transport energy through ATP. The more ATP we have, the more energy we have available. So let's take a look at NADH again. Once NADH reacts with oxygen and produces ATP, we have a redox reaction and we get NAD+. Now, Professor Birkmeyer doubts that it's possible to get NADH through the cell membrane. But the NADH that he has developed reacts with oxygen and makes sure we have NAD+ in the cell. And it works exactly the way calorie restriction does or physical exercise. But the same applies to cryotherapies, taking cold showers or ice baths or contrast baths, for example, or Kneipp cures. Ancient doctors had great ways of treating patients, but also thermal approaches, sauna, sweating, hypothermia, contrast baths, which is also what Dr. Bircher did. During the Spanish flu in 1917 and 1918, Dr. Bircher didn't lose a single patient. He usually treated soldiers referred to him in his clinic, and he treated them as follows. He exposed them to fresh vegan produce, but also with hypothermal contrast baths. The bathwater was heated up with the patient in the bathtub to 40 degrees centigrade. You had to have a healthy heart in order to be able to take such a treatment. And after 10 minutes, patients went to bed, were covered with blankets and sweated for an additional hour. This was supported with lime blossom tea, with lemon and honey, according to a proposal by Dr. Bircher, the guy who developed Bircher muesli. It's interesting to see that we're afraid that COVID-19 might become as bad as the Spanish flu. You've got to be aware of what happened at the time. The Spanish flu was so deadly because at the time we had no antibiotics available. The risk is that you develop pneumonia. If you have no antibiotic to treat pneumonia, which is of bacterial origin, you have a problem. As for the virus itself, the antibiotic doesn't help because it's a virus, cannot be treated with an antibiotic. But if it develops into a bacterial pneumonia with pneumococci, you've got to treat it with antibiotics. such antibiotics were not available in 1916 or 1918. This is why there were so many casualties. This just goes to show what you can achieve with intelligent treatment method, and it's quite a pity that so many doctors no longer have this knowledge of old, which even our grandmothers used. When I was a child, we were never given any drugs. When we had a cold or a flu, we were given leg compresses, or when we had an outer stye, raw liver tissue was put on our eye. There were the most fabulous domestic remedies that were applied. We also had inhalation of chamomile steam in case of sinusitis with fresh chamomile flowers and salt, and we inhaled the steam, and it all worked very well. And it's very, very sad that we have all forgotten about these fabulous medicines. Now let's go back here to the mechanism to the left by Professor Birkenmeier. Professor Birkenmeier made a very important contribution because he developed a solution for his father. His father was the pioneer in Parkinson's disease and helped develop the first methods to treat Parkinson's disease. He then suggested to his father to apply NADH infusions with huge success. NADH triggered the production of dopamine. Parkinson's disease always comes with a lack of dopamine, and the first treatments that Professor Birkenmeier's father administered were L-DOPA infusions. Patients were able very soon after the treatment to move around again, but this wasn't a long-lasting effect, and a solution has to be found to trigger dopamine emission, and that's what Professor Birkenmeier developed, to work it into a tablet in a stable form, because basically it's active hydrogen that we try to bind highly reactive substance. This hydrogen is used to propulse rockets into space, and the idea was to stabilize it, which seemed impossible before. But he was successful through NADH. With this approach, it was possible to bring it into the cell with oxygen to create ATP, and then as a byproduct have NAD+, which extends our life. So it's very important to understand this mechanism, because with this mechanism you can change very important parameters of your patient's life. Take a look at this chart here. This is something I produced in connection with Covid-19. Look at the biological age here and basic health, which we generate with reduced biological age. This helps to explain why Covid-19 mainly affects people with chronic illnesses. The horizontal axis is life, or duration of life. Now in 2020 the situation is much worse than 100 years ago. At the same time, we also need to look at our own individual lives, because during our individual lives the situation deteriorates. We have environmental pollution, for example, we have changes on planet Earth, and it becomes more and more difficult for us. We also grow older, all of us, so there is more and more pressure on us, pointing up quite steeply. We have smog, for example. We know that in Wuhan and northern Italy there was a lot of smog also. E-smog, I'll come back to this, electromagnetic fields, also heavy metals which we absorb through amalgam fillings, any other toxic substances coming from seed dressings, for example, dioxin, for example, applied to grass and gets back into our organism through the cow, through the meat we eat, and chronic diseases. Here you can also see a pie chart issued by the Italian government pretty much at the beginning of the corona cases in Italy, and it shows that about 25% was suffering from 1 or 2 chronic diseases, and about half of the patients had 2 or 3 or more chronic diseases and actually died from COVID-19. And then there were other factors that need to be taken into account, noise and stress, and the strength of our immune system tends to go down, not just during our life, but also over the period of time in general. In 2020, the content of immunoglobulin A is 20% lower than about 50 years ago. So we may all be back to normal, but in general, the strength of our immune response has become weaker. Now, this is due to a lack of vitamin D3, but also a lack of micronutrients in general. The food we consume is more and more processed. There are hardly any products that are really original. If you go to a supermarket, 90% of what you can buy is made of some basic ingredients like wheat, milk, sugar, what have you, and it just comes in different form and combinations. It more or less looks like we have a huge choice, but we don't really, because at the end of the day, the ingredients of Oreo cookies are not much different from any other kind of cookie you can buy, for example, McVitie's digestives. But there's more. We also don't exercise sufficiently, we don't sleep enough, we don't sleep very well. And we'll talk about the quality of sleep later on today. Perhaps we also treat ourselves to too much alcohol just to reward ourselves. We also smoke too much. And this will create this bubble here, which I think is a absolutely dangerous area. We can see the intersection of the two red lines, and as of this point, we are exposed to major danger. If there is a virus such as Covid19 or any other infection, we are very, very vulnerable indeed. There is a way to deal with this problem. The only sensible approach is to make sure we can extend the cross-section of the two lines as best we can, or make sure the two lines don't cross at all. As a result, we reduce electromagnetic fields, we make sure we detox on a regular basis. We will come back to this later as well. We also need to make sure we can spend as much time as possible out in nature, because we have more oxygen there, we've got ionized air in a forest, we've got to reduce stress. This will be another issue we'll talk about at a later stage. We also have to reduce noise, and we could do that by taking a walk in the woods, for example, and we need to stop our immune system becoming weaker. And we can do so by ensuring a D3 level which is always above 60 nanograms, by administering vitamin C infusions, or make sure we absorb 1 gram of vitamin C every day. As we heard from Professor Cheng from Shanghai in one of the news programs, he suggested to take up to 6 grams orally. We can also use supplements to keep the level of micronutrients high, perhaps also fast occasionally, 16 to 8, 5 to 2, by having enough exercise, by activating the sirtuins, our survival mechanism, by taking enough water, which also helps the body to get rid of any toxic substances, by working on our sleep as well very intensively. Sleep as well as breathing is extremely important. It doesn't cost to improve sleep and breathing, but it really makes a difference. Now, here we have two lines. They're green now. They don't cross, and we're in a safe area here. The bubble is green now. This only works up to a certain age, and you can see that at a later stage in your life, we still have no intersection here. And if a dangerous virus were to strike, the virus has no chance of causing any harm. So younger people may become infected as much as older people. They might actually transmit it more than older people, but they're not so much at risk. Let's now take a look at the reasons for aging. I have a few scientific studies here I'd like to discuss. Here we have a study from the year 2016 which clearly shows that post-traumatic stress disorders, experiences during war, led to premature aging. This study shows nicely that chronic inflammation also accelerates biological aging. All our cells get older more quickly. This study here basically shows the different sources of chronic inflammation in aging and the processes associated here, because they have a role to play during the aging process, and also, of course, present a risk factor. In red, I highlighted the important bits of this paragraph. We call this a pro-inflammatory situation. It's basically a situation of inflammation which persists, and we know that patients who have died from COVID-19 were in this pro-inflammatory state, and in connection with the infection, this created a cytokine storm which caused the organs to fail and triggered a strong immune system reaction. Let's take a look at the next study. Here we can see that emotional stress also makes us grow older more quickly. We know that soldiers from World War II came back with white hair, and we can also measure that. You can take a look at the length of the DNA telomeres, the little tails that become shorter and shorter. The more often the cells split, it's basically the shelf life of a cell. We can also see here another study here at the bottom. Loneliness also triggers shorter telomeres. Phobic fears also cause shorter telomeres. Untreated depression causes shortened telomeres. So we can easily see that emotional stress can have a massive impact on the way we age. That's an important aspect which we need to be able to control. And I'll talk about this later on in my presentation today. There are very simple approaches to keeping our emotions under control. Here's another study which shows us that stress has an impact on our sympathetic nervous system. The fibers become hyperactivated. The sympathetic nervous system switches to stress mode, and this has an influence on the melanocyte stem cells, which basically means that we just grow white hair more quickly. If we're able to keep the stress level down to keep out of a situation of tension, we heard this from our colleague Dr. Aslan from Bucharest, 18,000 patients. They looked at procaine, which is a neural therapeutic which we use in dentistry as well. With this substance, the aging process could be reversed, and she was able to show that patients grew dark hair again by applying procaine on a regular basis. The next study here is an interesting one because it shows very nicely that the oxidative and nitrosative stress is very important in in cancer, in the way cancer cells propagate, and it's something we need to look at more closely. Let's take a look at the natural reaction to an inflammation. The inflammation activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is totally normal and fine. As a result, a pro-inflammatory state emerges, which is also deliberate because the pathogen, the virus for example, can then be attacked. The antigen, so to speak. And then what happens? The sympathetic nervous fibers, the nervous fibers from the sympathetic nervous system, withdraw from the locus of inflammation, and the inflammation is pushed down in order to stop the catabolic state. Catabolic means to use, to consume, and anabolic means to build up. So we build up the system, we build up the cells to reach this anabolic state again. The catabolic state during an inflammation has to be reduced very quickly because we want to build up. We want to have good cells, strong cells, muscle cells, and defense cells to support our immune system. These defense systems and these defense cells will now take care of our cells, of the inflammation, either through the natural immune system or the acquired immune system. This would be the normal reaction to an acute inflammation. Let's now take a look what happens if we have chronic inflammation. In such a case, the sympathetic nervous system is constantly activated, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, which means that the system can no longer fine-tune. It's no longer in balance because there's bombardment all the time. There's always too much cortisol bombarding the body. So the fine-tuning of the inflammation through the nervous system collapses. This is what we call a chronic inflammatory condition. It's a sustained activated immune cells. They can no longer withdraw, and as a result, the catabolic process will be kept going. This is something that nature hasn't foreseen. Chronic stress should not be there over a long period of time, and it's basically a vicious circle because this stress, the sympathetic mode with adrenaline, noradrenaline and cortisol, sustains the inflammation on the one hand. On the other hand, the inflammation triggers the mechanisms that I just explained, the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. It's a vicious circle we can hardly get out of. That's what happens during chronic inflammation. And it basically answers all the questions. Dr. Klinghardt and myself, we've always been saying that the reason, the cause of all chronic diseases is basically chronic stress. The studies by Birkmeyer and Sinclair support this statement. Doctors such as Dr. Levy, which we had in our interview at the beginning of the COVID crisis, he said the cause of all chronic diseases is a chronic inflammation, and we can see here very clearly that it's basically the same. Chronic stress equals chronic inflammation and vice versa. It doesn't really matter what is first. There might be a chronic inflammation as a result of gluten sensitivity, or you might have chronic stress and then develop chronic inflammation. The two work together, and this is the kind of vicious circle we need to break out of, because the result at the end of the day is that tissue is being destroyed, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all the other diseases become more frequent. What I'd like to do now is to look at the three main reasons of stress and inflammations. On the one hand, as we already heard from the study, we have emotional stress, which can trigger chronic inflammation and accelerated aging. The second main stress is EMF, electromagnetic fields. Take a look at these pictures here. Unfortunately, they become much more frequent. We have these massive 5G antennas bombarding us all the time with radiation. We know that the action potential in nervous impulse conduction is at 40 millivolts. You can easily imagine that these waves, this radiation, has an influence on our nervous system. And the third major reason is dentistry. Endodontically treated teeth, but also amalgams, titanium alloys, etc. All of this will have an impact, but that's not our topic today. Let me come back to this point here, EMF, electromagnetic fields. Here we have a nice study, the European EMF guideline from 2016, which shows very nicely that we can see that patients exposed to electromagnetic fields very strongly, that they are more likely to suffer from chronic diseases during their life, such as specific types of cancer, but also Alzheimer's diseases And to the bottom right, I highlighted in red that we can also see flu-like symptoms if we are too much exposed to electromagnetic fields. That's very interesting, and I'll come back to this point. We can also see that oxidative, nitrosative stress is very pronounced. This kind of stress creates premature aging and also a higher risk of developing cancer. Let's take at the next study. It's a study which I have been using for quite some time now, for a year to be precise. It was published last year in February or May. Very interesting indeed, because it shows that even in case of an implantation, a surgical implantation, we can see an effect of EMF fields on the healing process post-operatively. What does it mean? If a patient is exposed to wireless LAN networks, or if they use their mobile phones often after surgery, the actual bone implant contact is reduced. This is a value that we measure on a regular basis in dental implantology. We can see that the quality of the bone, and in particular the bone cell differentiation, becomes slower, and it takes more time for proper osseointegration of the implant. We started 15 years ago to insulate our offices against wireless LAN. We actually tell our patients not to use any digital device for 2 weeks before dental surgery. No wireless LAN, no smartphones, or just keep the exposure as short as possible in order to avoid that this happens, because we know that this radiation destroys stem cells. The study published just about a year ago shows very nicely that we are going down the right avenue. Let's take a look at the next study. It's also a very interesting one. Or actually, it's not a study, it's a report from the internet. In Wuhan alone, we had at least 10,000 5G antennas installed. 10,000 antennas. This is about as much or even more than in the whole of the United States. Northern Italy is another hotspot with a large number of such 5G antennas. I wouldn't go as far as to say these antennas are to blame for what happened in Wuhan and Northern Italy, but we know that in Wuhan we also have very poor air quality, smog on a regular basis. And on top of that, we have 10,000 5G antennas triggering a pro-inflammatory state with the people living there. And then you get the virus, and it's just too much at the end of the day. You can't talk about one singular cause for COVID-19 because other studies say, why do we have such a high number of cases in New York? Because it's at the orifice of a large river. The second hotspot is New Orleans, or where Mississippi flows into the sea, and we have a study saying that the pesticide glyphosate contained in Roundup may be a predisposing factor to develop COVID-19. It's always the same thing. I can't just attribute the blame to 5G, glyphosate, electrosmog. We just have to make sure the two lines don't intersect, don't cross each other. It's hard to say who's responsible. It would be great to avoid any such influence, but at the end of the day, we've got to be realistic. When we knock on heaven's door at one point, we can't tell up there, we can't say up there, well, this is what we were promised. We ourselves have to become experts. We ourselves have to manage our own health. We as medical experts and dentists are called upon to take our mandate seriously, but everyone out there has to become a health expert. If you read what Steve Jobs wrote before he died, he was the perfect example of not being a health expert. He was exposed to incredible stress. I read his biography several times. I was very fascinated by this man, by what he developed and what he implemented. But we see that there was hardly any other person exposed to so much stress as Steve Jobs was. I operated on a number of his friends, and they all confirmed to me that they never met a person more stressed than Steve Jobs. Sometimes he was unable to speak in the evening because he was so exhausted. Every single cell was exhausted. He was fairly thin. He didn't drink alcohol. He had enough exercise, but it wasn't enough. He died at the age of 55. Despite having all the money available, he just died of chronic stress. Now, obviously, what finally killed him was pancreas cancer. Now, he was on his couch with his iPad precisely in this place on his tummy. So this was basically his predilection site where his constitution was weak, where the cancer attacked. But at the end of the day, what killed him was chronic stress. And it would have made sense for him to have worked on his biological age, because with that, he would have been able to substantially reduce the risk of developing cancer. In his last words, he writes something interesting. It's a very moving piece of literature. You can look at it on the internet. He said, "I should have read more in the Book of Health." And that's precisely what I'm aiming at. We ourselves have to assume the responsibility to read in this Book of Health. We all have to become an expert, a specialist in our health, because at the end of the day, every single one of us is responsible for our own lives. There's no point in being afraid of thousands of different diseases and trying to avoid this and that. This is good against heart attacks or against cancer. No, what we need to do is reduce our biological age, which will help us control everything else, because we can simply push time back. Let's take a look at this chart that I like a lot. It's the diagnoses in Swiss medical offices. We can see it's a major success. We've got the chronic diseases all going down until the year 1997, 1998. And then we can see that all the lines pick up exponentially. This was pretty much when mobile telephony was introduced. And it just adds to the stress we're already exposed to and is a burden for our immune system, be it permanent availability or a constant exposure to the radiation in this context. Right. Up until now, this was some sort of introduction, but also vital information. What I now like to talk about in more detail is sleep. Let's take a look at the various measures we can take to prepare well for sleep. It's very important to look at the last hour before we go to bed, because it is really decisive. What we need to do is to slow down, calm down, rule out any stress, any unrest, any meetings, reduce them as much as we can, and make sure that we cool down, that our body core temperature cools down. So no sports in the last hour before going to bed, no hypothermal contrast baths or hot showers. You should have at least an hour before going to bed. Cooling down is important. Go for a walk outside. I'm sure you know that if we feel a bit chilly and we snuggle up in our bed, we can fall asleep much more quickly. What we also need to do is reduce the light. In everything we do, we just have to think about what the situation was like a long time ago, 10,000 years ago, or even 100 and 200 years ago. There was no electricity at the time. Edison invented it much later. We may have had fire, possibly candlelight or paraffin lamps. And there was the sunset with red light. And that's exactly the kind of light we need to strive for before going to bed. We know that if we reduce the amount of light and if the color of the light turns to red, melatonin is emitted, and we know that this helps us fall asleep very quickly. What is completely wrong is to have bright light until the last minutes before going to bed, or even sitting in front of your computer. That's not good, because the bright light contains a lot of UV, and this destroys our melatonin. If we just look at our smartphones or our computers for a couple of minutes, melatonin will be destroyed. And we know, particularly now during Covid-19, no pregnant women and newborns or small children catch the virus because they have a very high level of melatonin, and melatonin is strongly antiviral. It also promotes deep sleep, and deep sleep is very important because that's when we regenerate. That's when we build up muscles. Muscles are extremely important. That's our safety net. Muscle cells can evolve into any other cell. It's the best energy storage, much better than fat deposits. And number 3, we build HGH, human growth hormone. If we can build it ourselves in deep sleep, we're in a much better position. We're like alchemists. You can also inject it, you can buy it. It costs thousands of euros, but if we can produce it during deep sleep, we get it for free. We extend our telomeres or reduce the shortening of the telomeres, and we create stem cells which can generate all other cells. That's what we can achieve during deep sleep. So we need to extend our deep sleep phase as best we can. And that's one reason why apparently Roger Federer, the tennis player, sleeps 12 hours every night, because this is the only way for him to get a sufficient number of deep sleep phases. I'm not sure it's true, but it sounds great. So it's important for us to reduce the light, the exposure to light, and make sure the light color turns to red. So it's perfect to go for a stroll in the evening, perhaps cool down a little bit. So don't walk quickly, no running, no jogging, just calm down. Perhaps talk to family members or friends, tell stories, play games, everything that puts you in a good mood. And don't work until late at night. Some alcohol may help to fall asleep more quickly. The disadvantage is that under the influence of alcohol, our heartbeat at rest goes up. If we have a heartbeat at rest of 60 to 70 and you go to bed, you feel your heart beating, and it's not good to fall asleep. So reduce alcohol in order to sleep better. And after lunch, you shouldn't drink any coffee. Let me go back one line. So there's caffeine, and caffeine has a long-lasting effect. What I can recommend is to order L-theanine, which is the antagonist of caffeine. In a herbal tea, you have a very high level of L-theanine, much more than caffeine. In black tea, you have much more caffeine than L-theanine. In green tea, we have a balance of caffeine and L-theanine. So green tea is completely neutral. If you want to wake up, get an English breakfast tea, black tea. If you want to slow down, if you want to calm down, have a herbal tea, chamomile tea, but you can also take L-theanine as a capsule. The rule of thumb would be 100 milligrams of L-theanine for every cup of coffee or espresso you have taken. So I always take the number of pills, L-theanine pills, that corresponds to the number of coffees that I have been drinking. So if I have 3 espressos until 12 o'clock at noon, I take 3 capsules of L-theanine in order to neutralize the bad effects of caffeine. There are good effects as well. The good effects on the heart and the brain remain untouched, but an increased heart rate per minute at rest and high blood pressure will be neutralized. If I drink coffee in the evening, or if I take an energy drink, if I have to stay awake on the motorway, then I would recommend to take the same amount in L-theanine in capsules before going to bed. It's obvious that we shouldn't have food very late. It's ideal to have dinner at 6 or 7 p.m. Make sure it's a light meal. We'll talk about meals later on. Let me give you an overview. What makes perfect sense to avoid raw food, no salad or lettuce, no raw vegetables, because the digestive juices are reduced, which makes it difficult for our stomach to digest raw food. So I would recommend to have cooked or fried or grilled food, grilled vegetables, cooked vegetables, fish, meat. If you don't want to be a vegetarian, make sure you always consume high quality fats and oils. Coconut oil, but also avocado contains high quality oil. You can also eat nuts, of course. No peanuts, by the way, because peanuts are not nuts in a botanical sense. They are pulses and contain aflatoxin. That would be negative. In the evening, you can easily eat eggs. If you suddenly feel hungry in the evening, just have a fried egg or something along these lines. And you've also got to make sure you keep the insulin level low. Make sure you only eat food with a low glycemic index. You can Google it, find out what the glycemic index of food is. Cortisol and insulin can be called the diabolic twins. We've got to try and keep them both at a low level. Anything to do with sugar or wheat meal products, all refined products, for example, are not very good in the evening, because what they do is they create spikes and peaks with the glycemic index. So sweet potatoes are much better than ordinary potatoes, because sweet potatoes do not produce peaks in the glycemic index. What we also need to do is make sure we sleep between 7 and 8 hours. And by that I mean sleep properly, not just being in bed for 7 and 8 hours. We've got to make sure we have a sleep efficiency in excess of 90%. That is to say, make sure when we are in bed for 8 hours, we've got to make sure we sleep 7.5 hours of these 8 hours. We should strive for 1.5 hours of deep sleep. I mentioned deep sleep before. It goes down over your life. A 20-year-old has a deep sleep factor of about 25 to 35%. A pregnant woman with a newborn has 35, 40, 45% deep sleep. And if we're 60, 70, 80 years of age, our deep sleep phase is only 5 to 10%, which of course also accelerates aging. About half an hour or 45 minutes ago, I showed you a slide with the measurements of the Oura ring. Think back of this slide. On that day, I had a deep sleep phase of 25%, and that's pretty much the average that I have achieved. I keep working on it. I want to get higher, but with 25%, I have already achieved the level of a 25 to 30-year-old. There are some levers that you can operate and have a massive influence on your health. And it's very simple. Sleep is one, but also stress, of course, breathing. These are all important aspects that we need to bear in mind. If we now look at the results of the Oura ring, we can also see the number of times we have breathed in and breathed out. It's always good to bring this number down. Somewhere between 12 to 13 breaths per minute is great. If we are at 16, 17, 18, it means that we're not really properly regenerated. And our heartbeat at rest at night should go below 50. In the second session, we will talk about this. We will talk about Wim Hof's breathing method and the ice baths he recommends. We will see that it's very easy to bring down the number of breaths and the heartbeat at rest, which will benefit our deep sleep. What is also important is to psychologically prepare for going to bed. We need to delegate any tasks or challenges to our subconscious. Our conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. 90% is below the surface. That's our subconscious, and it's very powerful. There is a saying in German which says that you learn a lot at night when you sleep. And it is true. If we are able to remember dreams, we are able to do incredible things in these dreams. We speak foreign languages in a very eloquent way, and we're surprised just at how outspoken we are. And it makes perfect sense for us to manage the time before going to bed very actively and delegate these challenges and tasks to our subconscious. Let's say we're just going to delegate this to our subconscious, take care of my problems at night, and it would be great to wake up in the morning and to have a solution for all of my problems. This will help us push back the worries that we may have that may preoccupy us. So it makes sense to have a notepad and a pen on your bedside cabinet, not your iPhone. If you turn on your iPhone or smartphone, you have bright light which destroys melatonin. Just a notepad and a pen, and you can write things down if need be, just a few notes, a few sentences to relieve your mind. And when we wake up at night and have these lucid dreams, when you have such lucid dreams, you are in a state where you can control what happens with you. It's somewhere between being awake and being fully asleep. There's no need to be stressed by having lucid dreams. It's a great thing. You can actually take an influence and drive your subconscious to solve problems or come up with ideas, create new thoughts, or invent something. What's also very important is melatonin again. We need to build it up as much as we can, and we can do so by ensuring that our light has a reddish color. We can also add to this by taking the right vitamins. B6, for example. B6 influences serotonin synthesis. Serotonin is a pre-stage of melatonin. Vitamin D3 influences the 5-HTP synthesis, which is a pre-stage of serotonin, and at the same time it also influences the parasympathetic nervous system. It makes us more relaxed. Magnesium makes us tired, which is why I do not recommend you take it in the morning. Magnesium XX means magnesium citrate, for example, no elementary magnesium, or omega-3, 3 capsules in the morning, 3 capsules in the evening, just to strengthen melatonin. That's better than just buying melatonin from a supplement shop and just taking these supplements. It's always better to build it ourselves. We build it anyway, but it's important not to destroy it by making the mistakes I mentioned earlier, and obviously also strengthening the pre-stages through BA3, D3, etc. Let's take a look at where we sleep. It's important to make sure that the room we sleep in is as dark as possible. There should be no visible light at all. If we don't manage to do that, let's buy a high quality sleeping masks, not the cheap ones you get in an aeroplane, but really sophisticated ones that we hardly feel, that don't really touch your eyelids. They just make sure you have 100% of light insulation. We need to turn the temperature down 17 to 19 degrees centigrade. not too warm. It should be cool. We need a great deal of oxygen. It makes perfect sense to ventilate your rooms properly before going to bed, in order to make sure you have fresh air, you have a cool temperature, which is easy at the moment because we're in late spring. If we don't succeed in doing that, we need to buy a face mask, and perhaps if we can't rule out the noise, we need to have earplugs as well. That's number one. Number two, we need to reduce radiation as much as possible, because in sleep we go to 7 to 14 hertz in the alpha phase, in the theta phase to 7 to 14 hertz. If we have an old power line in the wall, that's definitely not going to be good. It's possible also to install a device which will turn off electricity altogether. You just have to make sure you have no standby tools, and there should be no television in your bedroom, because even after turning off your television, such devices emit radioactive radiation for an hour or two. You can also just walk up to the fuse box and remove all the fuses. What you can also do is to avoid EMF wherever you can. We can do so by simply turning off our wireless LAN modem, pull the plug. If you live on your own, if the neighbors are far away, don't worry too much about other wireless LAN networks, because as for wireless LAN, the distance to the source of radiation is vital. Our own wireless LAN modems are the most dangerous ones. So make sure there is as much distance as possible. If you have a wireless LAN coming through the ceiling from your neighbor, it doesn't really matter that much. And turn off your smartphone. You can also do that with the Zevo base. You can have a plug to protect against the radiation. This Vivo base reorganizes the water molecules on our skin, setting them up in some sort of mesh which protects us against radiation. What would be even better is what you can see here, bottom right, a silver canopy. You can buy that from various suppliers. It's basically a mesh mosquito net made with silver fibers, and they help reducing radiation. What we've got to make sure is that when the canopy is closed, we have no mobile telephony reception at all. When we succeed in doing that, we have excellent preconditions for good sleep. So it's worthwhile investing money. Such a canopy may cost €1,000, but that's what a new smartphone costs as well. The only difference being that we will need the next one, the next smartphone next year, and with such a anti-radiation canopy, you can use it for your entire life. We spend at least a third of our lifetime in bed, and it's absolutely vital to ensure proper sleep, proper deep sleep, in order to stay healthy. So it makes sense to invest some money here. Perhaps you decide not to go on a particular holiday this year and to invest in perfect sleep conditions. You will live so much longer that you can spend many more holidays to catch up with the one you missed. So invest your money wisely. It's also important to look at when we go to bed and when we want to wake up. It always makes sense to wake up or get up 1.5 hours or a multiple of 1.5 hours after going to bed, to make sure we do not wake up or do not wake us up with an alarm clock when we're in the middle of deep sleep, once all the deep sleep hormones have been released into the bloodstream. Usually this is the case after 90 minutes. After 90 minutes you're in an ideal phase to wake up, so it's better to sleep 6 hours than 7 and 7.5, 7.5 and 9, etc. So a multiple of 1.5 hours is ideal, an ideal moment to get up. If you need half an hour to fall asleep, you need to add this half hour. Another important element is the time before midnight. The time before midnight counts double. If I go to bed at 9 p.m. and sleep through to midnight, I've already slept 6 hours, not 3 hours. If I get up at 3, it all adds up to 9 hours and I'm in perfect shape for a new day. It makes no sense for the workaholics among us to do what I did in my youth. I worked until 2 o'clock in the morning. I had destroyed all the melatonin and I had no pre-midnight sleep. I felt tired and stayed in bed until 9 and 10 o'clock, and you can see your surroundings beginning to bombard you with requests and tasks, etc. So it makes perfect sense to go to bed early, particularly now during the corona crisis, because the time before midnight counts double, and get up early. The early bird gets the worm, as the proverb says. And it's great to get up early. Nobody sends emails. Nobody calls you. The family is asleep. It's a great time to be working. And this is something that I also did during final exams in medical school. I went to bed at 7, slept until 12. That adds up to 10 hours. I got up at midnight and worked until the early afternoon. Then did some exercise and went home and went to bed early. It's fantastic to extend your sleeping time because the pre-midnight sleep is absolutely vital. It's also called natural sleep. It's fantastic. The rule of thumb simply is when it gets dark, go to bed. That's what human beings did in ancient times. And it would be completely wrong to keep on working way into the night because that would destroy the pre-midnight sleep. What we can also do is take a power nap during the day. There's a great app I would like to recommend to you. It's called SDS Sleep App, and it allows me to set a time. It's got a very nice music, conducive to sleep, and it wakes me up slowly after the preset time. And if I don't press stop, the app becomes fairly resolute and notorious until I am properly woken up again. Don't plan for more than 17 minutes of pure sleep, because after 18 or 19 minutes your body releases sleep hormones. I'm sure you have heard of Einstein or others who, when they took a nap, sat down in their armchair, took their house key in their hands, and when they fell asleep they dropped the key, and the noise of the key dropping down to the ground woke them up again, and that was the most natural way of waking them up again after just about these 17 minutes. If you know you take about 3 minutes to fall asleep, you set the timer at 20 minutes. And another interesting trick is to put on a face mask, an eye mask. In my office I have a mat, a blanket and a face mask, and even when I have courses here on the premises, I always withdraw to my office and take a 17-minute nap in order to be in perfect shape for the second part. And it also makes sense right before you go into your power nap session to have an espresso, because the espresso takes about 15 minutes until it materializes properly in your body, and it will then be easier to wake up again when the caffeine sets in. And at the end of the power nap phase, you then are fully alert, fully awake, and even better in shape. Don't forget L-theanine though. Alright, let's move on to the next level, which is the emotional level. What I'd like to talk about here is what I call a morning routine. The morning routine is vitally important because it's the first phase right after sleep. And it helps us to become more efficient, to trigger high performance at the push of a button. So it's important to have a ritual, no matter what happened the day before, no matter how well you slept, no matter how much alcohol you had the night before, whether you have to attend a meeting or go to the operating theatre, there needs to be a mechanism which at the push of a button makes it possible for me to show high performance. And this is a ritual that I need to build up. It makes sense for the monks, for example, to have straightforward routines, because by means of these rituals, these routines, we help our subconscious to show this high performance. When the alarm clock goes off in the morning, it's important not to click on snooze. If you want to sleep longer, then sleep 15 minutes longer from the very beginning. But once the alarm clock goes off, get up immediately. There should be no question about that. You will never leave your house without your shoes on, just as naturally should it be for you to get up when the alarm clock goes off. I don't find that easy myself, and I'm very honest with you about that. It's not always easy to get up, but the first thing I tell myself is switch off your brain. Don't allow any outside thoughts to disturb you. It's a bit like Groundhog Day. As soon as you start opening up to the outside world, you will be disturbed. So you get up, you switch off your brain and start with your morning routine. I start Routinist, which is another great app I would like to recommend to you. You can list the different steps of your routine. For example, if you have 5 or 10 minutes to get ready, time to prepare a smoothie or brush your teeth, etc. And then you could have 10 minutes for the first stretching exercise, 10 minutes for gymnastics, 15 minutes for HRV measurement, 10 minutes for Wim Hof breathing technique, etc. And this app can be started, and there's a countdown which forces you to follow the different steps in your routine and not stop anywhere, not get stopped along the way. Particularly in situations where you have a limited amount of time, if you're in a hotel, if I need to be at a certain place at 9 o'clock to give a presentation, I can turn off some of these activities. If I feel I'm not going to go for a run, I'm just going to do a selected number of these exercises. This app will tell me immediately when I need to get up to complete the exercise and meet my assignment according to plan. And it helps me to quickly run through the routine in an efficient manner. Then the first thing in the morning should be to drink 2 glasses of water. At home, I have a device fitted to my tap which purifies my water and adds oxygen to the water. That's an additional luxury. It's even better than pure tap water. In any case, I would advise against drinking sparkling water because it's just more convenient to drink natural tap water. If you live in an area where the tap water is of good quality, like here, Lake Constance, I recommend you drink tap water. You can also take it lukewarm because that's very positive for the body, as we know from Ayurveda. At night, we lose about 1 liter in terms of water. And then you can build up as you go along through the morning ritual. I usually build up 1 liter, 1.5 liter of water or hydration in any form, so that at the end of the routine I'm even in the plus. In summer months, of course, where we expect hot temperatures, it makes sense to take more water. But the most important thing is to resist going online. Wim Hof describes it as follows. He says you need to be rider of your own horse. We must avoid entering the crazy horse mode. As soon as we turn off our smartphone, check WhatsApp, check Instagram, our emails, text messages, what have you. As soon as that happens, we're no longer in control of our brain, because somewhere out there in the world who sent us a message decides what happens in our brain. That's what he calls the crazy horse mode. Our brain can be our biggest enemy, but also our best friend. So it's important for us to become rider of our own horse. We must not allow the outside world to determine what we think. We had an excellent night, had great sleep. Our subconscious worked properly, perhaps came up with some solutions to problems we may have had. And this is the kind of mode we need to preserve. I'm sure you know this. When you wake up in the morning, your mind is very clear. the ideas are still sort of working their way in your cortex. If we turn on our mobile phone, we destroy this creative process. So we need to be able to keep this creative process for as long as possible before establishing a dialogue, before establishing contact with the outside world. And once we start practicing this morning routine on a regular basis, it becomes more than a routine, it becomes a ritual. It's a bit like bank holidays, it's a bit like the weekend or the structure of the working week. Within the day, the morning routine becomes a ritual which will allow top performance. And then we start in the morning routine with sport, for example, stretching exercises, breathing exercises, meditation, and we will have enough time to complete them. What we must avoid is the following. If you say, I get up at 7 and then I see how much I can squeeze into my program before 9. It has to be the other way around. If I know I've got to be here at the clinic in the operating theatre at 9 o'clock, I need to know precisely how much time is necessary, how much time needs to be set aside to work through the morning routine, to make it the ritual I'm striving for. I mentioned Routinist, the app that I recommend. I know that if I need to be here at 9, I have to get up at 5:30 in order to complete my ritual. There's no mercy, no compromise, because otherwise I compromise my own plan. I compromise my plan and my ability to perform, and through that my biological age. It's also very important as part of the morning routine to determine the tasks or the objectives or targets even you set yourself. I always write down 3 targets. You can accomplish the most by setting very small targets. Every day you set another target, yet another step further, another level higher. And every morning I read through my targets. So 3 targets for the day. This may be very small things. Call a certain person, start a certain project, write a particular piece. Just small things which will help me to work my way towards the big picture, towards the big objective I have. And the biggest mistake I have also made, and most of us make, is that we either have no targets whatsoever. If you run into the wrong directions, you can run as fast as you like. You'll never get to the destination. Let me give you an example from Princeton University. This is where the elite of the elite studied. They polled the graduates and asked them how many of them actually had clearly defined goals or objectives in writing, and it was less than 10%. Even at an elite university, the likes of Princeton, only 10% of graduates actually had clearly defined objectives. Years later, they were polled again, and it became obvious that these 10% were healthier than everyone else. They clearly had fewer chronic diseases. They were also more successful, more wealthy than the other 90%. This is why I suggest set your targets. It makes no sense in going in one direction if you actually want to go in a different direction. And the targets shouldn't be like New Year's resolution, which you develop at the beginning of the year and then never think of them again. I took this idea from Warren Buffett, because he said that you've got to write down the 25 most important goals and then focus on the 5 top priority goals and invest no time in the other 20. So just focus on the top 5. And these top 5 objectives need to be in line with our values, with our value system. You will all have values in your life. These are my values: health, family, profession, or job. These are my most important values. It could be anything you like. These values, these priorities need to be set in the right order. For me, health is more important than family. Why? Well, if I am not healthy, I am not available for my family. And if I am healthy, I can be there for my family for as long as possible. So that's why health is more important to me than family. Health and family, however, takes priority over my job. I would never compromise my health or my family just for some professional success or some event in my job. Everybody has to decide for themselves what their top priority values are. And you've got to check your targets against your personal values. And there's another aspect that's important. Why comes first? How comes second? That's what my list actually says. I can always look at it on every device I have, a computer, an iPhone. There's the 5 targets, but there's always the why on top. And I wrote down in plain language why a particular objective or target is important. For example, in terms of health, health is important because I will be there for my family for as long as possible. And because I serve as a role model for my patients, for example, etc. So I clearly put down the why a particular objective is important, and I don't really think about the how at this time. I will then think about the how when I determine the daily targets. It's important to know what do I need to achieve, a couple of objectives per day, but it's important to know why a particular objective has to be met. Why comes first, how comes second. That's very important. And then we will be in a position to apply an important filter or yardstick to measure our targets against. To address the question, what is the meaning of life? People have been thinking about this question for centuries. The answer is straightforward. The meaning of life is about being happy, not more, not less. It's as simple as this. No matter who we ask what the meaning of life is, we always get the same answer. Sometimes we need to dig, we need to ask again and again, and the ultimate answer we will always get is because it makes me feel good. Ask a missionary, what's the meaning of life? Well, to spread Christianity. Great, and what do you do in order to achieve this? Well, I travel to villages to convert people to Christianity. And if I keep asking, what does it feel like once you've been able to convert 1,000 people to Christianity? At one point the missionary will say, because it makes me feel good. So that's what it all boils down to, about feeling good. And quite logically, it's easier to actually find the meaning of life if we don't have to rely on very complex plans and projects. When you would have to say, for example, I'm going to be happy when I have implemented complex abstract targets. If I say, for example, I feel great when I'm able to buy a wonderful holiday mansion on Mallorca, for example. In order to achieve this, you need to invest in terms of time and money and energy. But if you can create this feeling of happiness just by taking a walk in nature, by simply meeting your daily targets, you can find happiness, you can feel good without any complex detours. And something else is important. Don't just leave it at that. Try and reflect on it. I've kept my diary for 20 years now. I write down a couple of sentences every day just on reflecting on positive things, not on negative things. The magic moments that I experienced during the day, I write them down. And when I look back and if I read my diary from 2000 and 2001 and 2, my impression is that those were fantastic days, taking me through difficult patches as well. There were some difficult patches, but today I don't consider them difficult anymore. I look at them as very positive periods of time as a result of this mechanism. I reflect in the evening every day about what I did during the day and try and find an answer to the question whether I actually implemented what I wanted to achieve. Have I learned something? Is there a particular insight coming from the day? We can, of course, attend seminars like this webinar. We can read books, but we learn most intensively when we recapitulate, reflect on what we experienced during the day, what we did well, what we didn't do so well, what we could have improved. Write it down, summarize it, and this will basically create your very own catalogue of wisdom, which does not come from elsewhere, but comes from within. It's a very valuable tool. I keep reading in my diary, and it's fantastic to see just how much insight we gained from listening to ourselves. It's much stronger, I claim, than anything you would get from a seminar given by someone else. In my courses, I keep telling people, would you like to know how to improve your quality of life within 10 seconds? By a factor of 30? It's very easy. Just turn off push messages. This is a screenshot of my iPhone at 11:47 this morning. I'm offline here, as you can see, but you can't see a single red dot indicating the number of messages. So I've turned off completely the push service. I don't want to have any message on the lock screen at all. And even when I unlock my iPhone, I don't want to have a push message making me nervous or seducing me to open WhatsApp. No, I don't want that. I deliberately decide not to have that. I want to choose when I go online. I want to choose when I check my emails. I decide when I check any other medium where messages could be available. Try and not go online until 11 o'clock in the morning, because this is the most valuable, the most creative period of time where you can achieve the most. And that's another argument to go to bed early and get up early. We have scientific studies proving that up until 11 o'clock in the morning, we are most effective. If we can get done as much as possible until then, if we have to write a book, draft a concept, prepare a seminar, or record a webinar like this one, it is highly advisable to do so before lunch, because we know that we will be most efficient. Up until then, we've got to turn off digital contact with the outside world. We need to avoid being disturbed, being influenced by messages which will dissociate us from what we have on our mind. I used the corona crisis to go yet another step further. I only dedicate 1 hour per day to communicate with the outside world between 4 or 5 p.m. or 5 and 6 p.m. I quickly read through my emails, my WhatsApp messages, and any other channel I have. And then I'll be ready for phone calls or for Microsoft Teams or Zoom meetings, whatever. And there is a very clear effect coming from this. No problem is so urgent that it can't wait for some more time. I think back of the 5 weeks in the United States. Most time zones that I worked in have 5 to 7 hours of time difference. And when I turned on my iPhone, most messages had already lost their relevance anyway. So I decided deliberately to answer messages at a later stage at 9 p.m., 10 p.m. German time. When we only go online once a day, we are not governed by an external source for most of the day and are masters of our own work. We act rather than react. We don't just respond to what someone else outside tells us to do, no matter what the intentions are, no matter whether it's interesting for me or not. I act based on what I want to do. And the second step is that the wheel just starts turning more slowly. The longer it takes for me to respond to a message, the better. You know what it's like when you're on WhatsApp. You answer a question, you get an answer immediately, another message, yet another message, and all you do is answering messages all the time, and at the end of the day you realize that you weren't creative at all. There's nothing of substance you actually achieved during the day. We want to spend our days creating something with substance, something that is there to stay. So what we need to apply is a strategy, not a tactic. What's the difference between the two? Well, tactic would mean that on a cruise ship, you try and make sure you have the best deck chair. A strategy would mean to choose the right cruise ship. And then we also have efficiency versus effectiveness. Effectiveness means we look at the objective, whereas effectiveness just looks at the procedure to get there. It's important to do the right things rather than to do things right. All too often we focus on efficiency. We try to work through projects fast and correctly rather than thinking about whether the tasks we are completing are actually the right ones. So we need to put our money on the right strategy rather than on the right tactic. We react too often rather than acting based on our own initiative. And another important rule is eat the frog, which basically means to tackle the most challenging issues first in the morning. If you have a big project that you may not necessarily feel comfortable with, something that you don't like doing, or perhaps just something that we feel is like a huge mountain that is hard to overcome. If we've got to prepare a presentation, it doesn't make sense to do all the little things, all the other things first, because we won't have any energy left for the big one. Just push off anything that is not urgent. Deal with the big issue, the big problem first. Eat the frog right in the morning. Okay, we now move on to the next chapter. We are talking about the emotional level right now. In this webinar here, which is composed of various parts, we work on 3 levels. The physical level, everything to do with your body, with your health, but also on the emotional level. And number 3, on a professional level, everything to do with job and success. Now, talking about emotions, what we've got here is the morning routine, which we've already discussed, and we now move on to the next part, which is about emotions. Emotions that we can control, or to put it in different terms, we control our emotions anyway from early morning to late at night. We're a bit like a jukebox. You push a particular button and you either trigger depression or you trigger euphoria with a different button. We do this anyway, so it makes sense to fully know what the mechanisms are in order not to be at the mercy of the emotions. Emotions don't come to us. We go to meet the emotions. That's what Tony Robbins calls the emotional triad. The first axis of this triad is made of physiology and breathing. Our posture, the way we stand, the way we breathe, whether it's flat chest breathing or whether it's deep abdominal breathing, whether we are rigid or whether we are agile and flexible. This has a massive influence on the way we communicate. And the second aspect is language and TV. TV doesn't mean television, it doesn't mean transvestite, it means transformatorial or transformational vocabulary. The language we use, the terms we use, the words we use have a biochemical effect on our body. If you have children and you pick up the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning and you hear the word accident, I don't have to tell you what biochemical reactions you will perceive: adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, high heart rate, high blood pressure, just triggered by one single word. So we've got to be very cautious about the language we apply. We need to ensure some sort of linguistic hygiene. At home, we decided to no longer use the term problem. In the Volz family, we never talk about a problem. We always talk about challenges. We then had a seminar with the Dalai Lama and actually changed challenge to present. And there was a situation when our little daughters came home with tears in their eyes and said, "Mum, I had a very, very big present." But it feels completely different from a problem, from talking about a problem. In our family, when girls grew older, we decided that we don't want to talk about puberty anymore. We never actually mentioned the term puberty, and fortunately, we never had the problems that many other parents are struggling with, because puberty as a concept never existed in our family, and the problems were not there, simply not there. This is one way to avoid problems or situations, by simply not using the language associated with it. And it's well known that certain tribes, for example, indigenous tribes in Indonesia, don't use past tense or future tense in their language. They just have the present tense. So they can't talk about stories from the past. They cannot make plans for the future. Even if one member of the tribe leaves the tribe and comes back 3 months later, they don't perceive it as this person having been away, even though the person might have changed and might have grown a long beard. They behave the way they would behave as if this person had just left the tribe. It's a bit like with your dog. If you go away for 3 weeks or just go to the toilet, the dog will be very happy when you return. They have no concept of time. The more terms we have for future and past tense, the more we talk in the past and talk in the future. When you travel and something goes wrong with your luggage, you land at an airport and your luggage is lost, you go to Lost and Found and smash your fist on the counter and tell the people, I'm going to go through the roof. It's going to be quite different from a more gentle approach if you say, well, I'm not very happy with the fact that my luggage was lost. So we've got to be very careful with the vocabulary we employ, the transformational vocabulary, the kind of language we apply, because it has a strong impact on our feeling. Let's talk about the third level, which is the focus, what we focus on, where the focus goes, energy flows. Whatever we think about, that's where the energy goes. And it's very important to think about the images that we conjure up. This will substantially influence the way we perceive our emotions. Here's an interesting experiment carried out by the BBC. Students were put into 2 groups on a randomized control basis, and they were filmed as they went into an auditorium. The first group was asked to write a 1-page essay using words such as wise, fragile, etc. These are all terms that we associate with weakness, frailty, or aging. Whereas the second group was asked to write a 1-page essay using terms such as youth, freedom, flexibility, fancy stuff, etc. And the 2 groups were filmed again when they left the auditorium. And something seems to have happened within this 1 hour. One group looked at set of terms A, one looked at set of terms B. And they showed a different way of moving after this 1 hour. The first group, on average, seemed 10 years older than the second group. They had a more ponderous, a slower gait, a more serious facial expression, and it shows how important the language is. Let me repeat again: physiology, breathing, language, transformational vocabulary, and images and focus. These 3 have an important role to play. We're going to have a little exercise together, and I would like to ask you now to get up, stand up from the desk where you watch this webinar, and try and assume a posture as if you were depressed. Just imagine what a depressed person would look like. And I'm absolutely sure that most of you will probably bow forward a little bit, drop your arms, will most probably not look up, but most probably keep the axis below the horizontal line, perhaps even face the ground, probably not move around too much. It will probably be a rigid posture. We will probably have flat chest breathing, and that is precisely the way everyone responds. Everyone who is depressed, or every person who is told to assume the posture of a depressed person. And this experiment works around the globe. You can ask anyone, no matter what country someone comes from, everybody will assume more or less the same posture here. Now close your eyes and perhaps speak to yourself along the lines of, it all makes no sense, and perhaps also change your voice a little bit, speak in a lower tone, in a quieter fashion, in a manner which makes us feel weak. It all makes no sense, it's all the same every day, the corona crisis just does it for me, it's all going down the drain, etc. The images on televisions are terrible, the sick people on the hospital corridors, they can't even be handled by the intensive care units, they just die on their beds and are transported with military vehicles, and it just feels like a mess. If you try to tell me between 0 and 10 how depressed you feel, you will very quickly find that that this has an impact on you. Perhaps let's get out of this posture, perhaps stand up, turn around once or twice. And when you stand in a normal fashion again, what do you feel like now? On a scale from 0 to 10, you would probably say, well, I'm probably at, in a depressed state, at 2 or 3, I don't feel too bad. And then I'll tell you, let's go back into a state of depression. You know exactly what you need to do. Watch, face the ground. You can see the terrible images again. Your voice goes down again, becomes slower, perhaps losing volume as well. It's all terrible. It's a mess. And Corona's the biggest of all crises. Everything is going to become more difficult. More and more people are going to die. And if I ask you again on a scale from 0 to 10, where are you? No matter where you come from, perhaps depending on the exercise practice you've had, you will say 6, 7, 8 or 10. But if I ask you now to do something else, I could ask anyone around the globe, what would you like to do if I ask you to be in a euphoric state, for example? Then everyone will probably start moving around a little, probably put their hands up, and probably also look up rather than look down. If you want to feel euphoric, you probably won't face the ground. Simply by taking our arms up, we will probably start breathing more deeply right away. We will have the chest volume on top of that. We will have a higher breathing volume. We might move around a little bit as well, and we will employ different terms. Well, life is fantastic. Isn't the weather great? Since Corona, I've been out in nature so much more. The sky is wonderfully blue. No aeroplanes marring the image. The climate will get better. Everything will get better thanks to Corona. And then you will see different images. You might remember a time where you were out in the forest, a moment which you enjoy. The great weather, of course, helps us here. And if I ask you again on a scale from 0 to 10 how strong your euphoria is, depending on how much practice you have and how well you can express yourselves, how well your transformational vocabulary is, with the breathing, with the physiology, you will probably say, well, it's 10, 8 or 7 or 5 or 9. It doesn't matter. And if I ask you again to go back into the state of depression, you will realize in the same moment you will feel much worse. You know exactly what you need to do. And then I'll tell you, okay, let's go back to the euphoric state. The Russian doctor Nabokov calls this the pendulum of emotion. He says it's very good to practice changing from a depressed state to a euphoric state. And we know exactly what we need to do. These are the mechanisms coming from physiology, breathing, language, transformational vocabulary, image and focus. They help us to develop any kind of emotion we want to feel. At the click of a finger, snapping our fingers, we can say, let's go back, let's put our feet up on the table. Let's imagine we're in a hammock swinging in the wind, and we will immediately feel that we become tired and we're totally relaxed. So we can build up feelings that we can trigger at the click of a button. Using this triad, we do it anyway from early morning to late evening, it's always the result of this emotional triad. This is why it makes sense to know how things work, things that we do every day anyway, and use it to our benefit. Because if we put ourselves into a situation where we feel more energy, we will benefit. If we build up this euphoric state, we will deal with our family members in a completely different way. We can deal with our patients, our clients much better. We call this personal power as well. The more energy we have, the more energy we emanate, the stronger we can lead our teams, our patients, our clients, whatever. So it's absolutely vital to employ this tool, and it helps us to take better decisions as well. Tony Robbins also says, never ever do anything without being in a peak state. Always do something at a top situation, in a top situation. So we've got to create this peak situation, first of all, which can be achieved fairly easily by employing this triad. And then you pick up your smartphone, make the call, attend the meeting, go into a surgical process. This is how I build up my energy before every presentation, before every surgical intervention that I have to perform. And it doesn't matter whether I got out of bed with the wrong foot. It doesn't matter how much sleep I got, how many gin tonics I finished the day before. At the click of a button, I can build up this energy. We know that bad negative emotions are one of the three main sources for premature aging. They make us sick. And this is why we can control this emotional triad very actively. So this is the point to note. Practice regularly. You can also think about different forms of emotion. Just imagine what kind of posture you would have, what focus is required for a particular attitude or posture, what language, what vocabulary would you use in these situations. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the first part of our webinar. I think I talked for just a bit more than 2 hours. Let me give you an appetizer for what we have in store for you next time. We will be talking about the physical level. We will talk about the way we feed ourselves. We will talk about exercising, workout, what we can do to get better there. And something else that I only just started, which I'm a huge fan of, that's the Wim Hof method, but also cryotherapy. On an emotional level, we will talk about stress. We will also look at the physiological processes involved in stress reactions, different types of stress. There's cell stress, tissue stress, but emotional stress, physical stress, psychological stress, and the way we can avoid stress. On the level of effectiveness, we will talk about the Pareto principle. You may know this as the 80-20 rule, but we'll also talk about the Parkinson principle and a number of other highly effective methods to make our life easier. Well, that's it for now. This was the end of the first online seminar. I greatly enjoyed giving this seminar. I'd like to thank my colleagues working behind the scenes in charge of all the technical setup. We built up some new technology here, and I had to come to terms with the different cameras, the different angles, but it worked really well, I think. It was great fun, and this is the kind of challenge we're happy to confront. The crisis is the new normal. Now the auditorium here in front of me is empty. The legislator has spoken. It's probably the right decision, but we would like to use this as an opportunity to fine-tune our approach to make sure we can offer interesting, challenging webinars rather than just sharing a screen in an online meeting or having Zoom, Microsoft Teams meetings. We want to use this opportunity to produce something that is challenging. We step up the game, as I said earlier, and get better every day. Have a nice evening. Thank you very much. And we will announce in due course when the second part of the seminar will take place. Thank you and goodbye.